It was a quiet afternoon in a small-town cafe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The smell of coffee hung in the air, mixing with the faint sound of chatter and the scraping of cups. Behind the counter, a young woman moved quickly, serving customers with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had worked there for months, blending into the background, unnoticed by most people who came and went. In the corner of the cafe stood an old piano. Its wood was chipped, the keys slightly yellowed with time. Nobody had touched it in years. It was more of a decoration now, sitting there with a layer of dust like a forgotten memory. Sometimes when the cafe wasn't too busy, the girl would glance at it while wiping tables. Her gaze lingered a little longer than it should, as if there was a secret between her and that piano. She loved music once. She had grown up with it, breathing melodies the way others breathed air. But life had changed quickly, and dreams didn't always survive in the face of reality. Bills had to be paid. Her father's illness had eaten away at whatever savings the family had left. The piano lessons stopped, then school, and soon she was working double shifts just to get by. The girl who once dreamed of playing on stage was now refilling coffee cups and smiling at strangers who never looked her in the eye. That day, the cafe was quieter than usual. Only a few regulars sat around, chatting lazily. The girl was cleaning near the piano when one of the customers, a man with a loud laugh, pointed at it. "You ever play that thing?" he asked teasingly. The others chuckled. She looked up, her cheeks warming. "A little," she said softly, almost under her breath. The man laughed louder. "A little? I doubt it even works anymore. Go ahead, play something for us." The people around him laughed again, but not in a kind way. It was the kind of laughter that made you feel small. The kind that said, "You don't belong there." She smiled faintly, pretending it didn't sting. She went back to wiping the counter, hoping the conversation would move on. But something inside her stirred. The sound of their laughter echoed in her chest, mixing with an ache she hadn't felt in years. She looked at the piano again. Her heart beat faster. Her hands, still holding a cloth, trembled slightly. She could almost hear the notes in her head, the ones she hadn't played in so long. The cafe owner, a kind older woman, noticed her staring and said gently, "Go ahead if you want to. It could use a little music." The girl hesitated. Everyone was watching now, some with smirks, others curious. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She didn't like being the center of attention. But something about that dusty piano seemed to call to her, like it was waiting. She put the cloth down and walked slowly toward it. The laughter started again, softer this time, as if they couldn't believe she was actually doing it. She sat on the old bench, the wood creaking under her. For a moment, she just looked at the keys. They were uneven, a few chipped at the edges. Her reflection looked back at her from their glossy surface. She took a deep breath and pressed one key. A dull, broken note echoed across the room. Someone snickered. She pressed another, then another, her fingers awkward and unsure, but then her hands began to remember. It had been years since she'd touched a piano, but muscle memory is a strange thing. It never fully leaves you. Her fingers began to move more freely, finding chords she hadn't played since she was a teenager. The first few notes were shaky, uncertain, but soon they connected. Something clicked inside her, as if the years of silence had broken open. The melody began to flow, gentle at first, like the sound of a whisper turning into a story. The laughter stopped. One by one, heads turned toward her. The sound coming from the piano wasn't perfect, but it had something real, something raw and beautiful. Her hands moved faster, her shoulders relaxed, and her eyes softened as if she had stepped into another world. She forgot where she was. The cafe, the people, the laughter, it all faded. She was back in her childhood living room where her mother used to sit and listen, smiling softly as the notes filled the house. She remembered her father humming along from his armchair before he got sick. She remembered dreams that once felt possible. The melody she played now wasn't written on paper. It came from memory, from emotion, from every moment she had kept inside. Each note carried her story. The struggle, the exhaustion, the quiet resilience. No one spoke. The man who had laughed first was now staring, his smirk gone. The cafe owner stood still, her hands clasped together near her chest. Even the sound of the coffee machine stopped, as if the whole place held its breath. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air before fading. Silence filled the room. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then someone clapped softly. Another joined, and soon the whole room was applauding. The girl looked down, her face red, unsure of what to do. She gave a shy smile, stood up, and quietly went back behind the counter. The man who had teased her earlier said nothing. He just nodded slightly before returning to his drink. As the crowd began to talk again, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't the same noisy chatter as before. There was a warmth, a softness that hadn't been there earlier. The music had touched something in all of them, something they couldn't quite explain. For the rest of the day, customers kept glancing at her. Some smiled. Others whispered to each other. The piano in the corner no longer looked like a forgotten prop. It had life again, and so did she. Later that evening, after the cafe had closed and the lights were dim, she walked back to the piano. The place was quiet now. She sat again, gently running her fingers over the keys. She didn't play this time. She just touched them, feeling their cool surface beneath her hands. She thought about how it felt when she played, how everything else disappeared for a moment. It had been years since she'd felt that kind of peace. The sound of her music had reminded her that she was still there, underneath the exhaustion, the routine, the silence. The cafe owner came out from the back, carrying her bag. "You play beautifully," she said softly. "Don't hide that gift again." The girl smiled. "Thank you. I didn't think I could still do it." "Sometimes," the woman replied, "you just need a reason to remember who you are." They turned off the lights together and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the streets nearly empty. As she locked the door, the girl looked through the window at the old piano. It sat quietly in the corner, but it didn't seem lonely anymore. Walking home, she thought about the people's faces when she played, the way their eyes softened, the silence that followed. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about feeling alive again. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't stop playing this time. That night, lying in bed, she closed her eyes and imagined the piano keys beneath her fingers. Her mind replayed the melody, soft and clear. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long while she fell asleep smiling. The next morning, the cafe felt different. The same tables, the same smell of roasted beans, the same chatter, yet there was something new in the air. The regular customers looked up when she walked in, and for the first time their eyes held warmth instead of indifference. Someone called out softly, "You're the girl who played yesterday, right?" She smiled shyly and nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before getting to work. The man who had laughed at her the day before gave a small wave when she passed his table. He didn't say much, but the look in his eyes said enough. Something had changed in how they saw her. Throughout the morning, the piano sat quietly in the corner. Every time she passed it, she felt a pull. Not a heavy one, just a gentle tug, like it was asking her not to forget. Between taking orders and serving coffee, her thoughts kept drifting to those keys. At lunchtime, when the cafe was less busy, the owner leaned over and whispered, "If you want, you can play again today." "People seemed to love it yesterday," she hesitated. "I don't know. I don't want to disturb anyone," the woman chuckled. "Disturb them? You brought this place to life. Just play when you feel like it." Her words gave her courage. After wiping down the last table, she sat at the piano again. A few customers noticed right away, whispering to each other, waiting to see if she'd really play. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a second, and then she began. The first note was soft, like the start of a memory. Then the melody unfolded, gentle, warm, and full of emotion. The sound floated across the cafe, wrapping around the conversation, softening voices and drawing people closer. A mother with her young son stopped eating to listen. The boy's eyes widened as he leaned forward. Two friends who had been arguing paused, their expressions changing as the music filled the silence between them. The melody seemed to smooth out the rough edges of the day. When she finished, a small round of applause broke out again. This time it wasn't surprised, and it was grateful. People smiled at her, some even leaving small notes beside the tip jar. "Beautiful playing. Thank you for the music. You made my day." She read them quietly after her shift, her heart swelling in a way she hadn't felt in years. The piano became part of her routine after that. She didn't play every day, only when the moment felt right. But whenever she did, the cafe filled with a kind of calm that people kept coming back for. Strangers stopped by just to hear her play. The owner began placing a small sign outside, live piano during the afternoon. At first, she felt shy about it, but with each performance, she grew more confident. Her music started to tell stories about lost chances, quiet hopes, and gentle courage. And the people listened not just with their ears, but with their hearts. One rainy afternoon, a man with gray hair sat by the window, scribbling in a small notebook while she played. When she finished, he walked up and said, "You've got something special. Ever thought about playing outside this cafe?" She blinked, unsure how to answer. "I haven't played anywhere else in a long time." "You should," he said. "I teach music at the community center. We have a recital next month. You'd fit right in." The thought both scared and excited her. She had left that world behind years ago, but now it was calling again. She thanked him and promised to think about it. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she couldn't stop replaying his words. She remembered her younger self, the girl who used to practice for hours, dreaming of big stages. Somewhere along the way, life had dimmed that dream, but maybe it wasn't gone after all. The next few days, she played even more. Each time she sat at the piano, she felt more alive. Her fingers danced over the keys with growing confidence. Customers began asking for specific pieces. Children would sit near the piano, listening with wide eyes. One evening, the cafe was packed. Rain poured outside, and people had gathered inside for warmth and shelter. She began to play a slow, emotional piece, one she had written herself when her father was sick. The melody started soft, almost like a whisper, then rose into something powerful and heartbreaking. No one spoke. The rain outside became a quiet rhythm against the windows. For a few minutes, it felt as though time had stopped. When the final note faded, the cafe was silent. Then slowly, people began clapping. Not the quick kind of applause you hear at a performance, but the kind that comes from deep emotion. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. After her shift ended, the gray-haired man returned. That, he said, wasn't just playing. That was truth. "Please come to the community center. Let people hear you." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I'm ready." He smiled kindly. "You were ready the moment you touched those keys again." That night, she couldn't sleep. The thought of performing in front of strangers frightened her. But a small voice inside her, one she hadn't listened to in years, kept saying, "You can do this." The next morning, she decided to visit the community center. It was a small building near the park, filled with the sounds of instruments and laughter. She met the teacher again, who welcomed her warmly. He introduced her to a few students, some beginners, some advanced. And soon she was sitting at another piano, surrounded by music. When she played there for the first time, it felt different from the cafe. This was a space built for sound, for learning, for expression. Her hands trembled at first, but once she began, the same magic flowed out. The teacher nodded approvingly. The students watched with admiration, and she felt something inside her heal a little more. Over the following weeks, she started helping younger players at the center. She showed them how to express emotion through the notes, how to let their hearts speak through the keys. In teaching them, she rediscovered her own strength. The cafe still remained her favorite place, though. It was where her journey back to music had begun. Every time she sat down to play there, she remembered the first day. The laughter, the doubt, and the moment everything changed. People in town began talking about her. Some called her the piano girl. Others said she had a gift that could calm storms. Reporters even showed up once asking to record her performance, but she politely refused. She wasn't ready for fame. She just wanted to play. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young couple entered the cafe with a small keyboard under their arm. They approached her shyly after she played. "We saw your video online," the woman said. "Someone recorded you last week. We were moved. We wanted to give you this." The girl blinked in surprise. "You recorded me?" The woman nodded, smiling apologetically. "It was too beautiful not to share. People loved it. This is just a small gift, so you can play wherever you go." She didn't know what to say. She thanked them again and again. Holding the keyboard in her hands, she felt tears sting her eyes. For so long, she had been invisible. Now, her music had found its way into the world, carrying pieces of her story farther than she could have imagined. That evening, when the cafe was closing, the owner came over and said softly, "Looks like the world is finally hearing what we've known all along. You were never foolish to touch those keys." The girl smiled, her heart full. Maybe it's not about being heard, she said. Maybe it's about remembering why I started. The woman nodded. And you reminded all of us, too, that sometimes one small act of courage can change everything. As the lights dimmed and the last customer left, the piano sat in the corner once again, but it was no longer a forgotten piece of furniture. It had become the voice of something greater, of second chances, of quiet strength, of the beauty that can rise from ordinary days. And as she ran her fingers lightly over the keys one last time that night, the sound echoed softly, warm, alive, and full of promise for what was still to come. The girl had begun to find her rhythm again, both in music and in life. Yet beneath the joy of playing, there was a quiet shadow she had carried for years. Each time she sat at the piano, even in the cafe filled with applause and warmth, memories of the past crept in, uninvited but impossible to ignore. It had been years since she had touched a piano outside her childhood home. Back then, music had been everything, a world of possibility and hope. She had spent hours practicing, sometimes forgetting to eat, sometimes staying up late until her fingers ached and her eyes blurred with tears. Her parents had supported her, proud of every small achievement. But life had a way of testing dreams. Her father had fallen ill suddenly. The doctors had shaken their heads and the bills had started piling up almost immediately. Music, once a source of joy, became a luxury they could not afford. Piano lessons stopped. She tried to continue practicing at home, but the house had changed. Worries replaced melodies. Nights were filled with the sound of coughing, of whispered arguments about money, and of fear that life would never be the same. Eventually, she had to leave school to help her family. Every day became a struggle, finding work, paying bills, caring for her father. Music was pushed aside, buried beneath the weight of responsibility. She never stopped loving it, never stopped feeling its pull, but she believed that chapter of her life was over. The piano in her childhood home gathered dust as silent as her dreams, and yet that love never truly left her. It was there in quiet moments. A tune remembered while walking down a street, a rhythm in the tapping of rain on the windows, a harmony in the laughter of strangers. She carried it silently, unsure if the world would ever give her the chance to play again. One afternoon, after a particularly long shift at the cafe, she sat at the piano and let herself remember. She closed her eyes and pressed a single key. The note resonated, soft and comforting. Her hands moved slowly, almost tentatively at first, exploring the familiar shapes and patterns. With each chord, memories returned. She could hear her father humming along, could see her mother smiling as she played, could feel the excitement of recitals and competitions she had once loved. Tears came unexpectedly. She hadn't cried like this in years. The weight of lost time, of opportunities that had slipped away, pressed down on her. And yet, there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, she was facing the past, letting it be part of her story instead of something to hide. The cafe owner noticed the change immediately. "You okay?" she asked softly, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm fine, just remembering. Good memories or bad? Both," she admitted. "But it's okay, it feels honest." From that day on, whenever she played, a part of her story emerged through the music. She didn't tell anyone the full details and the struggles, the long nights, the fear and guilt she had carried. But it was all there in the notes, in the pauses, in the crescendos that rose unexpectedly, and in the delicate silence that followed each piece. People felt it without knowing why. One evening, after closing the cafe, she lingered longer at the piano. The rain tapped gently against the window, and she pressed keys slowly, letting the melody unfold naturally. A customer who had stayed late watched her quietly. When she finished, he spoke softly, almost hesitantly. "You play with your life in it, don't you?" She looked up, surprised. I guess I do." "You've been through a lot," he said. "And yet, here you are, still creating something beautiful." She nodded, not trusting her voice. It was true. She had been through more than most people could imagine, but she had survived. And now, for the first time in years, she felt like herself again. The person who loved music enough to keep coming back to it, no matter what. Days turned into weeks, and the cafe continued to fill with people eager to hear her play. Some came for the music, some for the atmosphere, but all of them sensed the emotion behind each note. And as she played, she slowly began sharing pieces of her story with the community, not in words, but through her music. The piano became a bridge between her past and the present, between loss and hope, between quiet suffering and quiet triumph. One day, the teacher from the community center came to visit. "Your music is changing people," he said. "They feel it. They respond to it. But more importantly, you're reconnecting with yourself." She looked at him, her hands resting on the keys. "I never thought I could play again," she admitted. "Not like this, not with people listening. I was too scared." "And now?" he asked. "Now," she whispered, "I can't imagine stopping." He smiled. "That's the courage of someone who's survived. That's why your music is so powerful. It's real." Her confidence grew slowly, but it was steady. She began to accept invitations to play at small gatherings, community events, and even local celebrations. Each time she carried a piece of her past with her. The struggles, the tears, the nights when hope felt impossible, and transformed them into something that could touch others. Yet, even as her world opened up, there were moments when the memories returned sharply, nights when she couldn't sleep, replaying the times she had failed to be enough for her family, or when she thought of the years she had lost. Those nights were quiet and painful, but she found a strange comfort in them too. They reminded her of why she had returned to music in the first place. One afternoon, while practicing a new piece, a little boy approached her. "Why do you play like that?" he asked, tilting his head curiously. "Like what?" she asked. "Like you're telling a story," he said. She smiled gently. "Because I am. Every song has a story. This one? It's mine." He nodded seriously as if he understood. "I want to tell stories too." "Then you should," she said. "And maybe one day someone will listen the way you're listening now." It was moments like these that reminded her how far she had come. She had gone from a life of hiding, of pretending everything was fine, to a life where she could express herself fully. And though the journey wasn't over, she knew she was ready for the next steps. Her music became a conversation with her own heart. Each note she played was a reflection of her past struggles and a promise to herself that she would never let fear silence her again. It was not about perfection or recognition. It was about truth. It was about standing in front of a piano, touching the keys, and saying to the world, and to herself, that she existed, that she had endured, and that she had something to give. The cafe remained her sanctuary. It was where she first reclaimed her voice, and it was where she continued to grow. People still came to listen, but now she noticed something remarkable. They were inspired by more than her skill. They were inspired by her courage, by the way she had risen from silence to speak through music. One evening, a woman approached her after a performance. "You know," she said softly, "I've been struggling with a lot lately. Hearing you play, it's reminded me that I can start again too." The girl felt a lump in her throat. She had never thought about the impact she could have on others beyond the beauty of sound itself, but now she realized that every note she played carried a piece of her story, and that story could give hope to someone else. And in that realization, she found peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from forgetting the past, but the kind that comes from embracing it. The kind that comes from acknowledging pain and still choosing to create, to move forward, to touch lives in ways she had never imagined. Her past was no longer a chain, but a foundation. The hardships she had endured, the years she had set aside her dreams, and the silent nights spent worrying about others, all of it became part of the music she played. Each performance was more than entertainment. It was testimony, courage, and grace wrapped into melody. And so day after day, note after note, she rebuilt herself. She touched the keys with reverence, not just for the instrument, but for the journey that had brought her there. She was no longer the girl who had been mocked and overlooked. She was a woman who had faced loss, carried her pain, and let it transform into something beautiful. People started to see the depth behind her music. They noticed the light in her eyes, the quiet confidence in her posture, and the story that lingered in every pause. They began to understand that the girl who had once been called a fool was now speaking a language that needed no words, a language that only music could carry. And somewhere deep inside, she felt ready. Ready to step further, to face the wider world and to share the melodies that had lived quietly in her heart for so long. The journey of rediscovery was far from over, but she had taken the hardest step already. She had touched the keys, and through them, touched herself again. After months of playing at the cafe, her music began to ripple beyond its walls. People started arriving earlier, lingering longer, sometimes sitting quietly just to listen as she let her fingers float across the keys. The cafe became more than a place for coffee. It was a space where lives paused for a moment, caught in the warmth of her melodies. One morning, the cafe owner approached her with an unusual request. "There's going to be a small-town festival next weekend," she said, "and they asked if someone could play the piano." I told them, "Well, that you might be willing." The girl's heart skipped. "Me? I've only played here for people who come to drink coffee." "That's exactly why they should hear you," the owner replied. "You make music that touches people. You can do this." The thought made her nervous. Her fingers had always felt safe on the familiar keys of the cafe piano. A stage, strangers. An audience larger than a handful of customers. These were uncharted waters. She hesitated, thinking of the years she had spent hiding her talent, thinking she wasn't enough. But there was also a spark, a quiet voice telling her that this was her chance to step forward, to let the music speak beyond walls she had grown comfortable in. On the day of the festival, the town square buzzed with activity. Stalls lined the streets, selling handmade crafts, baked goods, and colorful decorations. Children ran around laughing while families wandered from one stall to another. In the center, a small stage had been set up with a piano, polished and gleaming. She sat down at the piano, her hands hovering above the keys. The murmurs of the crowd pressed in, but she closed her eyes, letting the memory of her quiet afternoons at the cafe guide her. Slowly, she pressed the first key. A single note rang out, clear and warm, cutting through the chatter. She played softly at first, letting the notes settle like drops of rain across the square. People paused, turning toward her, drawn by the sound. Children stopped their games. Shopkeepers leaned on counters, and strangers on benches held their breath, waiting. Her hands began to move more confidently. She wasn't just playing music. She was telling a story. The story of a girl who had hidden her dreams, who had faced hardships, who had carried her love for music quietly through years of struggle. Every note spoke of hope, loss, courage, and resilience. By the time she reached the middle of her performance, even the wind seemed to soften, carrying the music across the square. A man stopped mid-step, listening with a smile, and a young woman wiped a tear from her cheek. She noticed an older gentleman in the back leaning on a cane, nodding slightly with each note. When she finished, there was a moment of silence so complete that it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then slowly applause erupted. People cheered, clapped, and some whistled, but it wasn't just excitement. They were moved. They had felt something real, something that touched their hearts. After the festival, she was approached by a local music teacher who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. "You have a gift," he said earnestly. "Have you ever considered formal performances? Concerts, recitals, even competitions?" She shook her head, uncertain. "I don't know. I've never done that. I only played for people here and there." He smiled. "Well, perhaps it's time you let the world hear you. You have something people need to feel, not just hear." His words lingered long after the festival. That night she sat by her window thinking about the possibilities. Fear whispered that she wasn't ready, that she had hidden too long, but a quiet confidence built over months of playing and sharing her music told her she could try. The next weeks were a flurry of invitations. A local library wanted her to play during a book launch. A small theater asked if she could perform at a community recital. Each time she accepted, her nervousness returned. But so did the thrill, the same feeling she had felt as a child, when the world seemed full of possibility. Her cafe performances continued too, but now they felt different. Customers came not just to drink coffee, but to watch her grow. They watched her fingers glide across the keys, watched her take small risks, watched her share pieces of herself that could not be expressed in words. And with every note, she became stronger, braver, more confident. One afternoon, a reporter came to the cafe. She had heard about the piano performances spreading through town and wanted to write a story. The girl hesitated at first, but agreed to talk. As they spoke, she shared the story of the lost years, of the struggles that had made her stop playing, and of the quiet rediscovery that had brought her back to the keys. The article ran a few days later in the local newspaper. People recognized her story instantly. Many came to the cafe just to meet the girl who had been called a fool, but had returned with courage and talent. Some brought instruments asking her advice. Others simply wanted to hear her play. Through all this attention, she remained grounded. She never sought the spotlight. She played because she loved it, because it healed her, and because it gave hope to others who needed to remember that dreams can be reborn, even after years of silence. The community center became another stage for her. She began teaching small groups of children, sharing techniques and stories, helping them connect with the music in their hearts. She realized that teaching was just another way of performing, her influence spreading quietly, shaping lives in ways she hadn't expected. And then came the opportunity she hadn't dared to imagine. A regional music festival invited her to perform. It was a bigger stage with more people, more lights, and the possibility of being seen beyond her town. She accepted, her heart racing with anticipation and nerves. On the day of the festival, as she sat backstage, she thought of the first time she had touched the keys in the cafe. She remembered the laughter, the doubt, and the moment when the music silenced everyone in the room. She smiled softly, realizing how far she had come. When she stepped onto the stage, lights shining down, she felt the same nervousness that had once held her back. But then she heard the first note in her mind, the melody she had practiced countless times, and she pressed the keys. The music poured out, carrying her story, her struggles, her triumphs. The audience was captivated. She could see people leaning forward, holding their breath, some with tears in their eyes. Every note seemed to resonate with their own lives, their hopes, fears, losses, and dreams. For a moment, it wasn't just her music. It was a shared experience, a connection that went beyond words. When the final note faded, the hall was silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause erupted, loud and heartfelt. People stood, clapping and cheering. She felt something she had never known before, a deep, overwhelming sense of belonging, of being understood, of being appreciated not just for skill but for the courage to share herself fully. That night, as she walked back to the quiet of her small apartment, she realized that her life had changed in ways she could not have predicted. The girl who had once been called a fool had stepped into a world that now listened when she spoke through music. She had discovered that talent, when combined with courage and persistence, could transform lives, not just her own, but the lives of everyone who heard her. The piano at the cafe remained her anchor. No matter how far she traveled, how many stages she played on, or how many people applauded, she always returned to that corner, to those familiar keys that had given her the first taste of courage. It was there that she remembered who she was, where she had come from, and why she had begun her journey in the first place. Through every performance, teaching session, and quiet afternoon at the cafe, she realized a profound truth. Talent is only part of the story. Bravery, resilience, and the willingness to rise after being silenced are what make music and life truly remarkable. And so her journey continued. Each note she played, each melody she shared, became a testament to the power of persistence, the beauty of rediscovery, and the incredible impact of simply believing in oneself. The town watched, inspired, as the girl who had been doubted and overlooked blossomed into the musician and storyteller she had always been meant to be. Her music was no longer confined to a single cafe, a small town, or even a single person's heart. It was spreading, touching lives and reminding everyone who listened that it is never too late to reclaim a dream, and that courage often begins with a single note. The girl had come a long way. From the quiet afternoons at the cafe to the applause of small-town festivals, she had learned to trust her music again. Yet nothing could compare to the day she stepped into the largest hall she had ever played in, a place filled with people she had never met. Her heart raced with nervous excitement. Every step toward the grand piano on stage felt like walking through a door into another world. Backstage, she took a deep breath. The lights were bright, the murmurs of the audience grew louder, and her hands trembled slightly. She thought of the first time she had touched a piano in the cafe. She remembered the laughter, the doubt, the feeling of being called a fool for daring to play. And now, years later, she was about to stand before hundreds of people, ready to share not just music but her story. When the stage manager gave her the signal, she walked forward slowly, her fingers brushing the polished keys. The hall was silent. Every eye seemed to be on her, waiting. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and pressed the first key. The sound filled the room, soft at first, almost fragile. But as her fingers moved, confidence replaced hesitation. The music began to flow, carrying with it the weight of years she had spent hiding her talent. Each note was a piece of her past, her struggles, her lost dreams, her silent courage, transformed into something beautiful and powerful. The audience was captivated. She could see people leaning forward, holding their breath, their expressions changing as the music reached them. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others stared, astonished, as if the notes themselves were telling a story they had never heard before. She played with every part of herself. The girl who had been ignored, the young woman who had feared failure, the artist who had waited years to be heard. Her fingers danced over the keys, sometimes delicate, sometimes bold, moving with a freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. The hall seemed to disappear. It was just her and the piano, and the invisible thread connecting her to every person listening. The music spoke louder than words ever could, telling a story of hope, resilience, and triumph over doubt. When she reached the final chord, she let it linger, stretching it as long as she could. Then she lifted her hands and the hall fell completely silent, the kind of silence that is heavy with emotion, the kind that follows something true and unforgettable. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one spoke. Then slowly applause began, one clap, then another, growing louder until the entire hall was cheering. People were on their feet, clapping, whistling, some even wiping tears from their eyes. She felt a warmth she had never known, a mix of relief, joy, and the satisfaction of finally being understood. Backstage, the teacher from the community center approached her, smiling broadly. "You did it," he said. "You've silenced every doubt, every critic. People see you now for who you really are." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "I was just playing, he repeated, laughing gently. "That's all it ever was, and yet it was everything. You've given people more than music. You've given them your story, and it moved them." Later she walked through the hall, quietly watching people as they talked and laughed, still buzzing from the performance. Some came up to her, shaking her hand, sharing their own stories of struggle, of lost dreams, of hope restored. One man, older and gray-haired, said simply, "Thank you. Your music reminded me that it's never too late to start again." That night in her small apartment, she sat by the window, letting the events of the day sink in. She thought about the girl who had been called a fool, the moments of doubt, the years of silence. She realized that all those experiences had led her to this point, giving her music a depth it would never have had otherwise. The piano had been her companion, her confidant, her bridge back to herself, and now it had given her something more, a chance to touch the lives of others, to show that courage and persistence can triumph over fear and doubt. Word of her performance spread quickly. People from nearby towns came to hear her play. Invitations arrived from concert halls, community events, and even local television programs. But she approached each opportunity with the same care and humility that had guided her from the very beginning. She played for the joy of music, for the healing it brought her, and for the quiet hope that it might inspire someone else. Even in the midst of recognition, she never forgot the cafe where it all began. She returned often, playing the old piano in the corner, smiling at familiar faces and sharing moments with those who had supported her from the start. The cafe owner often said, "You've changed so much, yet you still come back. That's the part I love the most." She knew it wasn't about fame or applause. It was about truth. Every note she played was a testament to her journey, to the struggles she had faced, and to the courage it had taken to keep going. People didn't just hear her music. They felt it, and in that feeling, they found a connection to their own lives, their own dreams. One evening, as she played a quiet, reflective piece, she noticed a young girl watching her with wide eyes. The girl reminded her of herself years ago, shy, uncertain, and full of unspoken dreams. After the performance, the girl approached timidly. "Can I learn to play like you someday?" she asked softly. The woman smiled, kneeling slightly to meet the child's gaze. "Of course," she said. "Music is about telling your story. You just have to start." And in that moment, she realized something profound. Her journey was never just about herself. It was about the ripple effect of courage, the inspiration that comes from standing up after being silenced, and the power of sharing one's true self with the world. The girl who had been mocked for touching the keys was no longer invisible. She had grown into a musician, a teacher, and a storyteller. She had shown that talent alone is never enough. It is the strength to face fear, the determination to continue despite doubt, and the willingness to share one's heart that truly creates magic. Years later, she would remember the first time she had pressed the keys in that quiet cafe. Laughed at by strangers, she would remember the fear, the hesitation, and the thrill of finding her voice again, and she would smile, knowing that those early doubts had been necessary. Without them, she might never have discovered the depth of her courage, the resilience of her spirit, or the joy of touching the hearts of countless people through her music. Her story became one told in hushed admiration, in the clapping of hands and in the quiet moments when a single note could stop a crowd in its tracks. And though she had once been called a fool, the world had learned the truth. The woman who touched the keys had done far more than play music. She had reminded everyone who listened that dreams are worth pursuing, courage is worth claiming, and one small act of bravery can change everything. And so she played. Every day she returned to the piano, whether on a stage, in a cafe, or at a small community center. Her music was no longer just her own. It belonged to the people who had been touched by it, to the lives it had quietly healed, and to the countless hearts that had been reminded of hope. And for the first time in a long time, she understood the full power of what she had once feared. The girl who had been mocked, ignored, and doubted had risen. She had fallen silent, only to speak in a voice louder than anyone could have imagined, a voice carried in the simple, pure, unforgettable language of music. The world had finally heard her, and in that moment everything had changed.